I found the note on a Tuesday morning, tucked under my windshield wiper like a parking ticket. 4 words, written in red ink that had bled into the paper from the rain. He knows you're alone. I stood in my driveway for a long time, holding that note, telling myself it meant nothing. But deep down, in that quiet place where instinct lives, I already knew. Something had been wrong for weeks. I just hadn't been willing to see it. If you enjoy mysterious and dramatic stories like this, make sure to subscribe to Francisko's Stories for more. New stories every week, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. My name is Daniel Marsh. And 6 months before I found that note, my wife, Claire, passed away. She died on a Wednesday afternoon in October in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and recycled air. Pancreatic cancer. From diagnosis to the end, it was 11 weeks. 11 weeks that felt like 11 years and 11 seconds at the same time. One morning she was complaining about back pain. A few months later, she was gone. We had been married for 14 years. We didn't have children. It had just been the two of us in our little house on Aldermore Lane in a quiet suburb outside of Portland, Oregon. 2 people who had built a whole world out of coffee in the morning, arguments about whose turn it was to cook dinner, weekend drives along the coast, and falling asleep to the sound of rain against the bedroom window. When she died, the world didn't end. That was the strange part. The sun kept rising, the neighbors kept mowing their lawns. My phone kept ringing with calls I didn't answer. And I was left standing in the middle of all that normal life, feeling like a building with no foundation, like I was still standing, but one strong wind would bring me down. I went back to work 3 weeks after the funeral. I was an inventory manager for a regional logistics company. Nothing glamorous, spreadsheets, warehouse reports, supplier contacts. But I was grateful for it. Grateful for the numbers that didn't ask me how I was holding up. Grateful for the routine. My manager, a soft-spoken woman named Patricia, offered me a temporary transfer to the night shift. She said it was just to ease me back in. Fewer people, less noise, less pressure. I said yes immediately. The truth was, I couldn't sleep anyway. The house was too quiet. The bed was too wide. At least on the night shift, I had a reason to be awake at 3 in the morning. So that became my life. I worked from 10 at night until 6 in the morning. I drove home in the pale gray light of early dawn. I made toast I didn't taste, watched television I didn't see, and slept badly until mid-afternoon. Then I got up and did it again. The neighborhood was a different place at those early morning hours. Most people were still asleep when I pulled into my driveway at 6:30. The street was empty. The houses were dark. Only the birds were awake, doing their business in the maple trees along the sidewalk. That was when I first noticed him. The house directly across the street from mine had been empty for almost 2 years. The previous owners, an older couple named the Hendersons, had moved to Arizona to be closer to their daughter. The house had sat on the market for a while, and then, about 6 weeks after Claire died, someone moved in. I didn't pay much attention at first. I saw a moving truck one afternoon when I was leaving for work. I noticed that the lights in the house started coming on. Normal things. A new neighbor had arrived. Good for them. But then, I started noticing the upstairs window. The house across from mine had a single window on the upper floor, positioned directly facing my bedroom window. It was a small window, the kind with old wooden frames that you have to prop open with a stick. Every morning when I came home and pulled into my driveway, I would glance up out of habit. And every morning, there was a shape behind that window. Not a clear shape. The glass was slightly frosted, or maybe just old and hazed over with age. But there was a form, a silhouette, the unmistakable outline of a person, standing very still, looking out. I told myself it was nothing. People stood at windows all the time. Maybe they liked the morning light. Maybe they were watching the birds too. Maybe it was just the way the curtain hung, and there was no one there at all. But it happened every single morning, without exception. Week 3 of my night shift routine, I met a man named Gus. Gerald was his real name. Gerald Okafor. But everyone at the warehouse called him Gus, and I never learned why. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with a slow way of moving that made him seem permanently relaxed. He had a thick gray beard and hands that looked like they had been carved out of oak. He worked in receiving, signing off on deliveries and checking manifests. He'd been at the company for 11 years. Gus was one of those rare people who could be silent with you without it feeling uncomfortable. Most of my night shift colleagues tried too hard. They heard about Claire and kept finding reasons to check on me, to offer me coffee I hadn't asked for, to give me the kind of sad smile that made me want to disappear. Gus never did any of that. He just worked alongside me and talked when there was something worth saying. We started taking our midnight break together. The warehouse had a small break room with a vending machine that only reliably dispensed one type of granola bar and a coffee maker that Gus had learned to operate through what appeared to be sheer intimidation. We would sit across from each other at the plastic table, drink our bad coffee, and talk. He told me about his kids. He had 3, all grown. He talked about a vegetable garden he was building in his backyard and his theory that tomatoes grew better when you talked to them. He mentioned once that he had lost his brother 5 years ago and that the first year was the hardest, but also the most important, that you had to let yourself feel the weight of it or it would follow you around for the rest of your life. He said it matter-of-factly, without drama, and I appreciated it more than I could say. I told him about Claire, not everything, not all at once, but pieces of her. The way she sang badly and loudly in the car, how she always burned the first pancake on purpose so the pan was seasoned right, how she had a collection of tiny ceramic animals on the windowsill in the kitchen that I hadn't been able to bring myself to move. He listened to all of it. He never tried to fix anything. It was in early December, about 5 weeks into our routine, that Gus first said something that changed everything. We were on our midnight break. It was a cold night, and someone had propped the back door of the break room open slightly, letting in a line of freezing air that nobody had bothered to complain about. Gus was telling me about a problem he was having with his furnace when he stopped mid-sentence and looked at me. "Danny," he said. He was one of the only people who called me Danny. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," I said. He looked down at his coffee cup for a moment. "You live on Aldermore Lane, right? Out near the Pinehurst area." "Yeah," I said. "Why?" He turned his cup slowly on the table. "Who moved into the house across from yours?" I felt a small, strange pull in my chest. "I don't know their name. Haven't introduced myself. Why are you asking?" Gus was quiet for a moment. He had a habit of going quiet before he said something important. I had learned to wait him out. "My cousin lives 2 streets over from you," he said finally. "Maple Court, you know it?" "I know where it is." "She called me about 3 weeks ago. Said she had seen a man she didn't recognize walking around your street a couple of times late at night. Like, past midnight. Slowly. Looking at houses." I put my coffee down. "That's not unusual. People walk at night." "No, I know," Gus said. "But she said the same man had been doing it several nights in a row, always stopping in front of the same house." He looked at me carefully. "She thought it was yours." I didn't say anything. "She said she almost called the non-emergency police line," Gus continued, "but she talked herself out of it, figured she was being paranoid." He paused. "I'm probably being paranoid too, just thought you should know." I thanked him and we finished our break and went back to work. But something had shifted. Some small, cold thing had settled at the base of my spine, and it didn't go away. That morning when I got home, I sat in my car for a few minutes before going inside. I looked at the house across the street, the upstairs window. The shape was there. Still. Watching. And I had told myself for weeks that I was imagining it, that grief was making me see things that weren't there, making me paranoid, making me lonely enough to invent danger just to have something to focus on. But Gus's cousin had seen someone too. I went inside and I didn't sleep well. Over the next week, I started paying closer attention. I had lived in that house for 9 years with Claire, and I knew every ordinary detail of Aldermore Lane, the way you know the layout of your own kitchen in the dark. I knew which streetlight flickered. I knew which house had the dog that barked at cars. I knew the rhythms of the place, so I started looking for things that didn't fit. I noticed that my garbage bins had been moved, not dramatically, just shifted a few inches from where I always left them against the side fence, the kind of movement that might happen if someone had brushed past them in the dark. I told myself the wind had done it. It had been a windy week. I noticed that the motion-sensing light above my garage had started triggering overnight, I knew this because I had set up a simple camera on my front porch after Claire died, mostly because the insurance company had offered a small discount. I checked the footage 3 times and saw the garage light flash on at 2:14 in the morning, 2:09 the night after that, and 1:57 the night after that. No car, no person visible on camera, just the light snapping on and off in the dark. I also noticed that my mail had been opened, not all of it, just one envelope. A letter from the hospital, some paperwork related to Claire's final bills. I might never have noticed except that I was certain I hadn't opened it. The envelope was slit cleanly along the top, the kind of cut you make with a letter opener, not the ragged tear I always made with my thumb. The letter inside was still there. Nothing was missing. But someone had read it. I stood at my kitchen counter holding that envelope for a long time. My hands were very steady, which surprised me. Some part of my brain was still working to explain it away. Maybe I had opened it in a distracted moment and forgotten. Maybe it had been damaged in transit. Maybe I was losing my mind. But I didn't believe any of that. I went back to the warehouse that night and I told Gus what I had found. I listed everything, the bins, the garage light, the envelope. He listened with his elbows on the table and his hands folded, watching me the way he always did when something was serious. When I finished, he didn't say anything immediately. "Have you talked to anyone on your street?" he asked finally. "Any other neighbors?" "I don't really know most of them," I said. "Claire was always the one who did that. She knew everyone. I mostly just waved." "You should talk to them," he said. "Quietly, just see if anyone else has noticed anything." I nodded. "I keep thinking about that upstairs window," I said. "The person who moved in across from me. I've never even seen their face." Gus looked at me carefully. "What do you know about them?" "Nothing," I said. "I don't even know if it's a man or a woman. I've just seen a shape." He nodded slowly. "Be careful, Danny," he said. It was simple, the way he said it. Not dramatic, not designed to scare me. Just honest. The way you say it to someone you actually care about. The next morning when I got home, I found the note on my windshield. 4 words in red ink. "He knows you're alone." I stood in my driveway in the thin December morning light and read it 4 times. The paper was damp from overnight drizzle. The ink had bled slightly at the edges, but the words were perfectly legible. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, printed in block letters rather than cursive. I looked up at the house across the street. The window was empty. For the first time in weeks, there was no shape behind the glass. I went inside. I locked the door. I sat at the kitchen table and I thought. I wasn't calling the police, not yet. I knew what they would say. I had watched enough crime programs to know that what I had was nothing. A note, a motion sensor, a letter that might have been opened by accident, an anonymous shape in a window I could barely see clearly. They would file a report and leave, and nothing would change. I needed to know who was in that house. I spent that afternoon, instead of sleeping, doing something I felt vaguely embarrassed about. I drove slowly past my own street from both directions, looking at the house across from mine as if I were a stranger seeing it for the first time. There was a single car in the driveway, a dark green sedan, older model, the kind that blends into parking lots so thoroughly you'd never pick it out. No bumper stickers, no distinguishing features, Oregon plates. I wrote down the plate number on my phone. Then I knocked on the door of my neighbor to the left, a retired schoolteacher named Howard Blaine. Howard was 72 years old, with a white mustache and a genuine interest in everyone's business that he had somehow converted into a reputation as a concerned community member rather than a nosy one. He opened the door before I had finished knocking, which suggested he had seen me coming. "Daniel," he said warmly. Come in. I've been meaning to check on you. How are you sleeping?" I told him I was fine. I asked him about the house across the street. His expression shifted, just slightly, a small tightening around the eyes. "Ah," he said. He led me into his kitchen and poured me a cup of tea I didn't ask for. Then he sat down across from me and folded his hands on the table the way Gus did, and I thought, not for the first time, that certain kinds of men had a very specific way of preparing to tell you something difficult. "A man moved in about 6 weeks ago," Howard said. "Renting, I believe. He introduced himself briefly to me when he arrived, said his name was Martin Webb. He paused. He was polite enough, seemed quiet, but, Daniel, there is something I want to tell you, and I want you to understand I have been going back and forth about whether to say anything. Please tell me, I said. Howard looked at his tea. About 3 weeks ago, I was up early. Couldn't sleep. It was maybe 5 in the morning, still dark. I looked out my front window and I saw this man, Martin, standing in his driveway. He paused again. He was looking at your house. How long did he stand there? I watched him for about 20 minutes, Howard said. He didn't move. He just stood there in the dark, looking at your house. I told myself there was some innocent explanation, but then I saw it again the following week, same time, same thing. He met my eyes. I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner. I didn't want to alarm you. You've had enough to deal with. Did he ever say anything to you? About me? About Claire? Howard hesitated. He asked about you once. He came over with some kind of question about garbage collection schedules. It seemed like a pretext. At the end of the conversation, he said he had heard the neighborhood had recently had a bereavement. He asked if you still lived alone in the house. Howard's jaw tightened slightly. I told him it was none of his business and I went inside. I drove home slowly after that. Martin Webb. I had a name now. I also had a plate number, a physical description from Howard, medium height, dark hair, mid-40s, always wearing a gray jacket, and the knowledge that he had been watching my house for weeks. But I still didn't know why. I did something that felt slightly illegal, but probably wasn't. I searched the name Martin Webb on every platform I could think of. Social media, public record sites, local news archives, there was almost nothing. A few common name matches in other states, no photos that matched Howard's description, no Oregon connections that I could find. Whoever Martin Webb was, he was either very boring or very careful. And boring people don't stand in driveways at 5 in the morning watching their neighbor's house. That night at work, I told Gus everything. The note, the car, Howard's account, the name. Gus was quiet for a longer time than usual. Danny, he said, have you thought about whether this could be connected to Claire? I had thought about it. Briefly, and then pushed it away because it opened a door I wasn't ready to walk through. Claire. My Claire, who burned pancakes on purpose and sang off-key to songs she didn't know all the words to. What could this possibly have to do with her? She died of cancer, I said. There's nothing to connect. I know, Gus said carefully. I'm not suggesting there is. I'm asking if there's anything in her past, before you or separate from you, that you might not know about. Something that could explain why someone would take an interest in her house, in her husband, after her death. I wanted to dismiss the question, but I sat with it. The truth was that Claire and I had met when she was 29 and I was 31. She had moved to Portland from another city. She had never talked much about her life before. I had never pushed. Everyone is allowed their before. We had been so focused on building our now that the before had seemed unimportant. But sitting in that cold break room at midnight, I started to think about the things I didn't know. When I got home that morning, instead of sleeping, I went to the room I'd been avoiding. Claire's home office. It was a small room off the hallway that she had used for her freelance accounting work. After she died, I'd closed the door and not opened it. Her things were still in there. Files, books, her laptop, the little potted cactus she had named Gerald that was somehow still alive. I sat down at her desk. I felt wrong being there, like I was trespassing in someone else's life. In a way, I was. I opened the drawer in her desk that I had never had reason to open before. Pens, paper clips, a small notebook. I opened the notebook. It was a ledger of some kind. Columns of numbers, dates, initials. I'm an inventory manager. I know how to read a ledger. And what I saw in this one made my chest go cold. The numbers were large. Transfers, by the look of them. In and out. The dates went back 4 years. The initials at the top of each column meant nothing to me. But at the bottom of the last page, in Claire's handwriting, were 2 words and a phone number. Call MWMW Martin Webb. I sat very still in my dead wife's office for a very long time. I tried to think about this rationally. Claire had been an accountant. She had clients. She managed other people's money. It was possible, completely possible, that Martin Webb was a former client, that he had hired her for some legitimate service, and these were legitimate records. But the numbers were too large for ordinary personal accounting, and legitimate clients didn't stand in driveways at 5 in the morning watching the house of a widow they had supposedly hired to balance their books. I went through the rest of the drawer carefully. Under a folder of standard tax forms, I found an envelope. Inside was a single photograph, 3 people at what looked like a restaurant table. Claire on the left, smiling that smile I would know anywhere. A man I didn't recognize on the right. And between them, a man whose face I now recognized because Howard had described him well enough, and because something deep in my gut had already connected all of this before my brain caught up. Martin Webb. He was smiling in the photo. He had his arm around Claire's shoulders, not romantically, the body language wasn't that, but comfortably, the way you sit next to someone you have known for a long time. I turned the photo over. On the back, in Claire's handwriting, Chicago, 2017. We had met in 2014. In 2017, Claire had told me she was visiting a college friend in Seattle for a long weekend. I hadn't gone. I'd been busy with a work project. Chicago, 2017. I put the photograph down on the desk. Outside, the day had gone gray, and a light rain was beginning. The little cactus Claire had named Gerald sat on the corner of the desk, perfectly composed, asking nothing of anyone. I made myself think clearly. I was looking at evidence of something. I didn't know what yet. An affair was the obvious conclusion, and the one my heart was trying not to run toward. But the ledger suggested something more complicated. Something financial. I called Gus. It was 11 in the morning, and he was probably sleeping. He picked up on the 3rd ring. "Danny? I need to tell you something," I said, "and I need you to help me think through it." I told him about the ledger, the initials, the numbers, the phone number with MW beside it, the photograph. There was a long silence. "Okay," Gus said. His voice was very calm. "Okay, are you at home right now?" "Yes." "Is your car in the driveway?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because if this man has been watching your house, he knows your schedule. He knows when you leave for work and when you come home. If he sees you've been awake and moving around at an unusual time, it might prompt him to do something." I hadn't thought of it that way. "What do I do?" "Sit tight," Gus said, "and don't call him. Whatever you do, don't call that number yet. I want to look into something. Give me a day." "Gus, what are you thinking?" Another pause. "My son-in-law works in financial compliance," he said. "I'm not going to say more than that right now, but if those ledger entries look like what I think they might look like, this is bigger than a strange neighbor." He hung up. I sat in the quiet house and listened to the rain. That night, I almost didn't go to work, but I thought about what Gus had said. Routine. Don't tip anything. I got in my car at 9:30 as usual and drove to the warehouse. The house across the street was dark when I left, but the green sedan was in the driveway. At midnight, Gus found me at the shelving units and gestured toward the break room. We sat down. He put his phone on the table between us, face up. "I talked to my son-in-law," he said. "I described the ledger to him, the pattern you described. Large numbers, in and out over several years, coded initials." He looked at me. "He thinks it sounds like a layering operation." "Money laundering?" I said. The word felt strange in my mouth. Too large for this conversation. Too large for my quiet house on Aldermore Lane and my wife's little potted cactus. "Specifically the middle stage," Gus said. "You take money that's already been placed somewhere it shouldn't be, and you move it through legitimate-looking accounts to make it harder to trace. An accountant is a useful person to have in a setup like that. They know how to structure transactions, how to make things look ordinary." I felt something move through me that I couldn't quite name. Not anger, not grief, something heavier than both. "You think Claire was laundering money?" "I think Claire may have been involved in something she understood completely," Gus said, "or something she got pulled into and couldn't get out of. I don't know which, but those are 2 very different situations." "And Martin Webb?" "I think he was the person who brought her in," Gus said, "or the person she was doing it for, or both." He paused. "And I think he came back after she died because there's money somewhere that he wants. Money that he's afraid might be traceable back to him, or records that could expose him." The opened mail. The ledger. the surveillance. It all clicked into place with a terrible, quiet logic. Martin Webb wasn't watching me because of anything I had done. He was watching me because he was afraid of what I might find. He had needed to know if I was going through Claire's things, if I was close to discovering whatever she had been keeping hidden. The note on my windshield hadn't been a threat directed at me from him. It had been a warning directed to me from someone else. "Gus," I said slowly. "Who else knows I live on that street?" He looked at me. "My cousin," he said, and then, a beat later, "She lives 2 streets over." "She saw someone walking at night," I said. "She must have seen Webb. She knew what he was doing, or suspected it, and she found my car and left me that note." Gus closed his eyes briefly. "I should have put that together," he said quietly. I pulled out my phone. I had saved the photograph of Claire, the man I didn't know, and Martin Webb. I showed it to Gus. "Do you recognize either of the other 2 people?" He looked at the photo for a long moment, then he pointed to the unidentified man. "I don't know him." "I don't either." I looked at the photo again. The man was perhaps 60, silver-haired, heavy-set. He was smiling at the camera with the ease of someone who was used to being photographed, the kind of ease that comes from money or power or both. I spent that night at the warehouse doing very little actual work. When morning came, instead of driving home, I did something impulsive. I drove to a 24-hour copy shop, photographed the ledger pages on my phone, and emailed them to myself. Then, I drove home, parked, and as I walked past my car toward the front door, I glanced across the street. Martin Webb was standing in his driveway, not at the window this time. In the driveway. In his gray jacket, hands in his pockets, in the early morning light, looking directly at me. We made eye contact. He didn't look away. He didn't wave. He just looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read from across the street. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't friendly. It was something else, something almost like exhaustion. Then he turned and went inside. I stood on my front step with my keys in my hand and my heart going at twice its normal speed. I called the police that afternoon, not the emergency line. I asked for a non-emergency report and I told them I had reason to believe I was being watched by a man with possible connections to financial crimes, and I had documents that might be relevant to an ongoing investigation. I wasn't sure there was an ongoing investigation, but I was betting that if money laundering was involved, there might be. The officer I spoke to was patient and professional, and almost certainly would not have taken me seriously if I hadn't mentioned the ledger and the photograph. But I did, and there was a pause on the line, and she said she would pass my information to the appropriate team, and someone would be in touch. Someone was in touch the following morning. 2 people, actually. A man and a woman in plain clothes who showed me badges I examined very carefully, and who sat in my kitchen and listened to everything I had to say. What they told me, carefully and in stages, was more than I had been prepared for. Martin Webb's real name was not Martin Webb. It was a name I won't repeat here for reasons the detectives explained related to an active investigation. He had been known to federal financial investigators for several years in connection with a money movement operation with ties to at least 3 states. He was not, they said, considered dangerous in the conventional sense. He was not a violent man. He was a financial criminal, which is a different and in some ways more invisible kind. Claire had been recruited by him in 2016. Not manipulated, not coerced, at least not initially. She had been struggling with a debt I didn't know about, something that had followed her from her life before me, and he had offered her a way out. By 2017, she was fully embedded. By 2019, she was trying to find a way to extricate herself. The ledger, the detectives told me, appeared to be a record she had been keeping as potential leverage, evidence of transactions that implicated him far more than her. She had known she was sick before I did. She had had symptoms she hadn't told me about for months, and in those months, she'd been trying to put the ledger somewhere safe, somewhere he couldn't find it, somewhere that would surface after she was gone if something happened to her. She had left it in the desk drawer. In the office I had kept closed for 6 months out of grief. She had left it where she knew I would eventually find it. I thought about that for a very long time afterward, about what that meant, about the woman who sang badly in the car and burned the first pancake on purpose, about the choice she had made at 29 when she was desperate and afraid, and the choice she had made at 43 when she was dying, about the distance between those two choices and everything that lived in the space between them. The man in the photograph, the silver-haired man at the restaurant table, was identified to me only as a person of interest in the broader investigation. I was told not to discuss him. I haven't. Martin Webb, or whatever his name was taken in for questioning 2 days after the detective sat at my kitchen table. I watched from my window as 2 unmarked cars blocked his driveway in the early afternoon. I watched him walk out of his front door in the gray jacket and get into one of the cars without protest. He moved with that same exhausted quality I had seen in his face the morning we made eye contact, like a man who'd been waiting for something to finally be over. The house across the street was empty again within a week. Howard came over with a bottle of decent whiskey and we sat in my kitchen and didn't say much for a while. He told me that whatever Claire had been involved in didn't change what he had known of her as a neighbor, that people were complicated, that complicated people still deserved to be grieved fully and without condition. It was possibly the wisest thing anyone said to me in that entire period, and I thanked him for it. Gus and I still take our midnight break together. The new year came and things began, very slowly, to look different. Not better exactly, not worse, just different in the way that time eventually makes things different, whether you're ready or not. I moved the ceramic animals from the kitchen windowsill. Not out of the house, I put them on the windowsill in Claire's office next to the cactus named Gerald, who is still, improbably, alive. I still work the night shift. I still drive home in the early morning. The house on Aldermore Lane is quiet, and the window across the street is dark, and some mornings I stand in my driveway for a moment before going inside, and I look at the space where all of this happened and try to hold 2 things at once: that I loved her, that I didn't know her completely. Both of those things are true. I've decided they're allowed to be. The note is still in a drawer in my kitchen. He knows you're alone. I've thought about throwing it away, and I haven't done it yet. Maybe because it was the first honest warning I received in the middle of all of it. Maybe because I want to remember that someone I never met, a woman 2 streets over who noticed something wrong and decided it was worth a piece of paper and a red pen, might have changed everything. Or maybe I just keep it, because some things need to be held on to a little longer before you let them go. I'm still figuring out which things are which.